Miss Marple and the Widow Who Predicts Death Hello, and a warm welcome from Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, your host for tonight. It always makes me smile to see how these mysteries bring together listeners from all around the world. Tell me, where are you tuning in from? And is it sunny, rainy, or snowy where you are? Leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe for new stories every day. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. Candle, Calendar, and a Whisper. The first thing that struck Miss Marple about that particular November afternoon was the quality of the light. It had that peculiar golden gray cast that comes to St. Mary Mead in late autumn, when the smoke from garden bonfires hangs low over the village green, and the air smells of damp leaves and approaching winter. She had been sitting in her drawing room, ostensibly working on a piece of knitting for the church bazaar, but in reality watching the comings and goings on the high street with that mild, seemingly unfocused attention that had proved so useful to her over the years. It was therefore quite natural that she should notice Mrs. Margaret Temple emerging from the vicarage gate with an expression on her face that Miss Marple could only describe as troubled. Now Mrs. Temple was not a woman given to dramatic displays of emotion. She was one of those gentle, self-effacing widows who devote themselves to good works and the maintenance of a small household without ever drawing particular attention to themselves. She kept her regular pew at St. Swithin's, maintained the ledgers for the Sick Comfort Fund with scrupulous accuracy, and could be relied upon for a dozen quiet kindnesses that went largely unnoticed by the village at large, which made the expression on her face all the more remarkable. Miss Marple set down her knitting with that decisive movement that her nephew, Raymond, would have recognized as a sign of awakened interest. Through her window, she watched as Mrs. Temple paused at the corner near the Blue Boar, apparently uncertain of her direction, before turning resolutely towards Gossington Hall. How very interesting, thought Miss Marple. It was perhaps 20 minutes later when the telephone rang. Miss Marple was not surprised to hear Dolly Bantry's voice, carrying that mixture of amusement and genuine concern that characterized her old friend's approach to village life. "Jane, are you at home? I'm coming around immediately. Something rather odd has happened, and I think you ought to hear about it." "Of course, Dolly, dear. I shall put the kettle on." Lady Bantry arrived in a flurry of tweeds and good intentions, her cheeks pink from the brisk walk and her eyes bright with the promise of interesting news. Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands and waited. "It's Margaret Temple," Dolly began, settling herself into the chintz armchair with the air of one preparing for a long story. "She came to see me this afternoon, and Jane, she was in the most dreadful state. Well, not dreadful exactly. Not in the way that foolish woman Mrs. Price Ridley gets into a state about nothing at all, but genuinely upset. Worried, you know." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly and passed the plate of seed cake. "She told me the most extraordinary thing," Dolly continued, lowering her voice, though they were quite alone. "She's been receiving messages, anonymous messages, Jane, pushed through her letterbox. Nasty things written on black-edged cards, the sort one uses for morning announcements." "How very unpleasant," murmured Miss Marple. "But that's not the worst of it. These messages, they predict deaths. Specific deaths with names and times. The first one came at noon today. It said, and Margaret showed it to me, written in this dreadful blocky printing, 'Mr. Amos Brackley, Tuesday. After evensong.'" Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythmic clicking. "Mr. Brackley. That would be the retired railway man who lives in one of the cottages near the station." Exactly. Now Margaret was so distressed by this horrid card that she didn't quite know what to do. She couldn't bring herself to show it to anyone, you see. She thought people would think her either mad or malicious. So when she went to the vicarage this afternoon to deliver some papers, she simply whispered to Griselda that she had a presentiment, a feeling about poor Mr. Brackley. She said it would happen after evensong. And did it? Dolly set down her teacup with a distinct clink. That's just it. Jane. At 20 minutes to 8 this evening, just as people were coming out of church, young Tom Fletcher went to call on his grandfather, Mr. Brackley, and found him dead in his armchair by the fire. Dr. Haydock was sent for immediately. He said it was almost certainly the heart, old vessels, you know, and Mr. Brackley was past 75. How very sad, said Miss Marple. He was a good man, I believe, always very conscientious about his garden. Yes, but Jane, don't you see? Margaret had predicted it. Or rather, someone had predicted it and told her, and now it's come true. The village is buzzing with it already. Mrs. Price Ridley was holding forth in the post office about second sight and ancient gifts, and you know how these things spread. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her bright blue eyes fixed on some point beyond Dolly's shoulder. Then she said quite gently, I think I should like to call on Mrs. Temple tomorrow. Perhaps I might take her some of my quince jelly. She was so kind when I had that touch of bronchitis last winter. You don't believe in presentiments, do you, Jane? I believe in a great many things, Dolly dear, but I find that presentiments, like so many other phenomena, often have quite mundane explanations when one takes the trouble to look for them. Tell me, did Mrs. Temple mention whether she had kept this card? She said she destroyed it, burned it. I think she was so distressed by the thing. Of course, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. One would be. After Dolly departed, fortified by tea and seed cake and the comforting thought that Miss Marple was taking an interest, the old lady sat for some time in her chair, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The room grew dimmer as the early winter twilight gathered, but she did not rise to turn on the lamps. A black-edged card pushed through a letterbox. A prediction that had come true. A gentle widow frightened into pretending she had special knowledge rather than admitting to receiving such a cruel message. And somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone who had known exactly when Amos Brackley would die. Miss Marple rose at last and went to her writing desk. She took out a small notebook, the kind she used for keeping track of her garden plantings and village events, and wrote in her neat, old-fashioned hand, Mr. A. Brackley, Tuesday evening after evensong predicted. Black-edged card, noon delivery, Mrs. Temple informed. She paused, tapping her pen against her lips, then added, Note, Mrs. T maintains sick comfort fund ledgers. District nurse connections. Must investigate further. Outside, the street lamps came on one by one, casting their gentle glow over St. Mary Mead. In the gathering darkness, a figure moved past Miss Marple's gate, walking with the brisk, purposeful stride of someone on professional rounds. Miss Marple, glancing up from her notebook, recognized the silhouette of Nurse Phyllis Eade, the district nurse, returning no doubt from her evening calls. A capable woman, Miss Marple reflected, greatly admired in the village for her devotion to duty. She returned to her notebook and made one more entry. Nurse evening round, Tuesday time. Then she closed the book, put away her pen, and went to draw the curtains against the night. Chapter 2. A Time Foretold. Then evensong bells. The funeral of Amos Brackley took place on a Thursday afternoon under skies that threatened rain, but never quite delivered it. Miss Marple, standing among the small gathering at the graveside, observed that the village had turned out in respectable numbers. Mr. Brackley had been a quiet man, but his years of steady work on the railway and his regular attendance at the Bell and Dragon on Saturday evenings had earned him a modest place in St. Mary Mead's collective memory. Ernest Vale, the undertaker, conducted proceedings with his customary proprietary hush, moving among the mourners with that particular combination of solemnity and satisfaction that characterized his profession. Miss Marple noticed him exchange a brief word with Mrs. Temple, who stood pale and subdued near the lich gate, and saw the widow flinch slightly at whatever he had murmured to her. The days that followed Mr. Brackley's passing settled into the ordinary rhythms of village life. The autumn deepened, chrysanthemums bloomed in cottage gardens, and the evening air carried the sharp scent of wood smoke. Miss Marple maintained her usual routines, but those who knew her well might have noticed that her afternoon walks took her past the post office rather more frequently than necessary, and that she had developed a sudden interest in the precise timing of mail collections. It was Miss Marple's particular talent to make herself useful in ways that brought her into contact with people and information. On the Monday following the funeral, she happened to be in the parish hall when the knitting circle gathered for their weekly meeting. The talk inevitably turned to Mrs. Temple and her uncanny foreknowledge. Of course, "My aunt had the second sight," Mrs. Price Ridley announced with authority. "It runs in certain families, Celtic blood, you know." Miss Marple, her needles moving with practiced efficiency, made a small, non-committal sound that might have meant anything. "I think it's dreadful," said young Miss Hartnell, who worked in the library. Poor Mrs. Temple must be beside herself. Imagine knowing such things and not being able to prevent them. "Perhaps," suggested Miss Marple mildly, "it is even more dreadful to be told such things by someone else." This observation produced a thoughtful silence, broken by the arrival of Nurse Phyllis Eade, who bustled in with her characteristic briskness. She was a handsome woman in her early 40s with capable hands and an air of professional competence that inspired confidence in her patients. "Ladies," she greeted them cheerfully, "I trust I'm not too late for tea." The conversation turned to more practical matters: the upcoming church bazaar, the state of the vicar's cold, the persistent damp in Mrs. Fletcher's cottage. Miss Marple listened and knitted and said very little, which was often her most productive state. It was as the meeting was breaking up that Ruth Denham arrived, slightly breathless and apologizing for her lateness. Ruth was a small, neat woman in her 50s who took in sewing and alterations. She had been diabetic for several years, a fact that everyone knew, because she was meticulous about managing her condition and often spoke of it with the slightly anxious pride of someone who'd learned to accommodate a chronic difficulty. "I'm so sorry," Ruth said, pressing a hand to her chest. "I felt a bit lightheaded this afternoon. I may have miscalculated my dose this morning." Nurse Eade frowned professionally. "You must be more careful, Ruth. You know how important it is to maintain the proper balance." "Oh, I am careful, Phyllis. Truly I am. But sometimes I think—" Ruth hesitated, then shook her head. "Well, never mind. I'm sure I'm just being foolish." Miss Marple, gathering her knitting into her capacious bag, filed this exchange away with that mental precision that had served her so well over the years. The second warning came 2 weeks later on a Tuesday evening that had turned unexpectedly cold. Mrs. Temple received Miss Marple in a small sitting room with an air of barely suppressed agitation. The room was tidy to the point of severity, with everything in its appointed place and not a cushion askew. On the mantelpiece stood a single photograph of a man in uniform, Mr. Temple, lost in the First War, and beside it an almanac of the old-fashioned sort, bound in red cloth with gilt edging. Miss Marple, "I'm so glad you've come," Mrs. Temple said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do. It's happened again." She produced from her apron pocket another black-edged card, handling it as though it might burn her fingers. The message was brief and terrible. "Ruth Denham, before first frost." "When did this arrive?" Miss Marple asked gently. "This afternoon, pushed through the letterbox just as before. I heard it drop onto the mat at about 2. Miss Marple, I can't bear this. Last night when I saw Ruth at the knitting circle, I felt I should warn her. But how could I? How could I show her this dreadful thing? So I went to the vicarage after supper and told Griselda that I had a feeling about Ruth, a presentiment. Griselda thought I was being morbid, but she was kind about it. May I see the envelope? Mrs. Temple handed it over with visible relief. Miss Marple examined it carefully. The postmark was clear. St. Mary Mead, 5:15 p.m. collection the previous day. The stamp was slightly tilted, and the address was written in an elaborate curly script, quite different from the blocky printing of the first message. Have you kept the other envelope? Miss Marple inquired. No, I burned it with the card. I couldn't bear to have it in the house. Of course. Most understandable. Tell me, Mrs. Temple, you maintain the Sick Comfort Fund records, do you not? The abrupt change of subject seemed to confuse the widow. Why, yes, I've done so for nearly 3 years now. I deliver the receipts to Nurse Eade each month, and she signs them after her rounds. And the cards, the black-edged ones, where would one obtain such things in St. Mary Mead? Oh, any stationer, I suppose, or from Mr. Vale directly. He keeps a stock for families who wish to send personal notes of condolence. Miss Marple nodded slowly. I think, my dear, that you should show this card to Inspector Slack. This is not a matter of concealment, however distressing it may be. But before Mrs. Temple could respond, the telephone in the hall rang with sudden urgency. It was Griselda Clement, the vicar's wife, her voice high with shock. Margaret! Oh, thank goodness you're home. It's Ruth Denham. She collapsed at home this afternoon just after tea. Dr. Haydock has been with her all evening, but I'm afraid, Margaret, she's just passed away. He said something about ketoacidosis, her diabetes, that she must have neglected her insulin. And Margaret, the strangest thing, when they found her, the first frost was just beginning on the green, the first frost of the season. Mrs. Temple's hand shook so violently that Miss Marple took the telephone from her and spoke calmly to Griselda, promising to come at once to the vicarage. When she had rung off, she turned to find the widow white-faced and trembling. You see, Mrs. Temple whispered, before first frost. It's come true again. What am I, Miss Marple? What terrible thing has happened to me? You're not terrible at all, my dear, Miss Marple said firmly. You are being used. And that is a very different matter indeed. She picked up the black-edged card in its envelope, handling them by their corners, and placed them carefully in her handbag. Now, she said, you must tell me everything. Have you received any other cards? Any at all? Mrs. Temple nodded miserably. One more? It came this morning. I haven't dared open it properly, just saw enough to know. She retrieved a third envelope from the drawer of her writing desk and handed it to Miss Marple with shaking fingers. Miss Marple opened it carefully. The message read, Mrs. Edith Hartwell, the 29th, 9:30. Mrs. Hartwell, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, the benefactor who endowed the Sick Comfort Fund. That would be 9 days hence. Yes, Mrs. Temple said faintly. And Miss Marple, I saw something when I looked at my almanac this morning. There are little crosses marked on certain dates, the day Mr. Brackley died and today when Ruth has died. But I never made those marks. Someone has been in my house. Or I don't know what to think anymore. Miss Marple opened the almanac and studied the marked pages with care. The crosses were indeed there, penciled lightly beside the dates, but something about them caught her attention. She tilted the page to the light. 2 pressures, she murmured, one very light and tentative, as though someone traced over an existing mark, and one firm and deliberate beneath it. She looked up at Mrs. Temple's frightened face. You must not touch this book again, she said. And tomorrow morning you and I are going to call on Inspector Slack. It is time for the official machinery to engage with this matter, however much it may alarm the village. Mrs. Temple nodded wordlessly. As Miss Marple walked home through the darkening streets, she noticed Nurse Eade's bicycle propped against the fence of the parish hall, and through the lighted window she could see the nurse herself, apparently filling out forms at one of the tables. Conscientious woman, Miss Marple thought, always attending to her duties. But when she reached home and laid the 3 envelopes side by side on her dining table, she noticed something else. Despite the different handwriting styles on each envelope, there was a consistency to them that troubled her. The spacing between Saint and Mary was identical. The stamps all tilted at precisely the same angle, slightly to the right. 3 disguises, she thought. But one hand, and on the reverse of the second envelope, barely visible in the lamplight, was a faint, oily smudge, circular and deliberate, as though someone had sealed it with a thumb that bore traces of hand cream. Miss Marple sat for a long time looking at those envelopes and thinking about nurses and their routines, about postboxes and collection times, about the careful maintenance of medical records and the trust placed in those who kept them. Before first frost, she said aloud to her empty room, and Ruth Denham died exactly then. Not heart failure, like poor Mr. Brackley, but diabetes mismanaged. How very convenient for someone familiar with insulin dosages. She rose and went to her telephone. Inspector Slack would not be pleased to be disturbed so late in the evening, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that politeness must sometimes yield to necessity. There were 9 days until the 29th. 9 days to prevent a third death. Foretold. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices. 2 stamps on one hand. Inspector Slack arrived at Gossington Hall the following morning with the air of a man who's been summoned against his better judgment. He was a stolid individual with a tendency to regard village affairs as beneath the dignity of proper police work, and Miss Marple's interventions in previous matters had done little to improve his disposition toward amateur detection. Lady Bantry, however, had insisted that her drawing-room was the proper venue for what she termed a council of war, and Inspector Slack, whatever his private reservations, could not easily refuse the request of one of the county's more prominent residents. "Now then," he began, settling himself onto one of Dolly's more fragile chairs with audible reluctance, "Mrs. Temple has made a statement about these anonymous cards. Most distressing, I'm sure, but I'm not certain what action you expect me to take. 2 deaths from natural causes, both elderly people with known health conditions." Ruth Denham was 54. Miss Marple interjected gently. "Hardly elderly, Inspector." "Be that as it may, Dr. Haydock has certified both deaths as natural. Heart failure in the first instance, diabetic complications in the second. There's no evidence of foul play." "Nevertheless," said Dolly firmly, "someone has been sending threats to poor Margaret Temple, and those threats have come true. Surely that deserves investigation." Miss Marple, who had been arranging the 3 envelopes on Dolly's mahogany table with the precision of a jeweler displaying precious stones, spoke without looking up. "Inspector, would you be so kind as to examine these envelopes? I should very much value your professional opinion." Slack approached the table with the weariness of a man who suspects a trap. Miss Marple had placed the envelopes in a row, each positioned to display both the address and the postmark. "You will observe," Miss Marple continued in her mild voice, "that the handwriting differs on each envelope. The first uses labeled block printing, the second a rather ornate cursive script, and the third employs capital letters throughout." "Obvious disguise," Slack muttered. "Whoever sent these didn't want to be identified." "Precisely. And yet, if you look more carefully, you will notice certain consistencies. The spacing between the words Saint and Mary is identical on all 3 envelopes, approximately 1 centimeter. The stamps are affixed at the same angle, tilted slightly rightward. And here," she indicated the second envelope, "you can see a faint oily mark on the seal." Slack bent closer. His professional interest finally engaged despite himself. "The postmarks are all from St. Mary Mead," Miss Marple went on. 2 show the 515 collection, 1 the 130. All were posted from the box near the parish hall, not the High Street box. Someone wished Mrs. Temple to receive these cards at specific times before each death occurred, but not so far in advance as to allow for any preventive action. You're suggesting these aren't predictions at all, Dolly said slowly. You think someone is planning these deaths and using poor Margaret as some sort of, what would you call it? A screen, Miss Marple replied. A witch's screen, as it were. If the village believes that Mrs. Temple possesses uncanny foreknowledge, then when people die at the predicted times, everyone speaks of fate and destiny rather than examining the circumstances too closely. Inspector Slack straightened up, his expression troubled. That's a serious accusation, Miss Marple. You're saying someone in St. Mary Mead is committing murder and disguising it as natural death. I am saying it is a possibility that should not be dismissed simply because Dr. Haydock found no obvious signs of violence. There are subtler methods, Inspector, particularly for someone with medical knowledge. The nurse, Slack said abruptly. You're thinking of Nurse Eade. I am thinking of several people, Miss Marple corrected gently. But I confess that certain observations have led me to take particular interest in those who move regularly through the village on predictable schedules. Nurse Eade makes her district rounds at set times. Mr. Oswald Rakes collects insurance premiums on Thursdays. Mr. Vale, the undertaker, keeps regular hours at his establishment. Any of them might post letters at convenient moments during their daily routines. But why? Dolly demanded. What possible motive could any of them have for killing poor Mr. Brackley and Ruth Denham? That, Miss Marple admitted, is what we must discover. Though I suspect Mrs. Hartwell may provide the answer, if we can prevent the third prediction from coming true. She turned to Inspector Slack with sudden decisiveness. Inspector, I should like to examine the Sick Comfort Fund records. Mrs. Temple maintains the ledgers and delivers receipts to Nurse Eade monthly. There may be nothing amiss, but it seems prudent to verify the accounts, particularly given that Mrs. Hartwell endowed the fund and might reasonably take an interest in its management. Slack nodded slowly. I'll need Mrs. Temple's permission for that. I believe you'll find her cooperative. She called on me this morning before you arrived. She mentioned something that I found rather interesting, a torn corner of black-edged card that she discovered in her coal scuttle, though she insists she burned all the threatening messages immediately upon receipt. Someone planted it there, Dolly said, or Mrs. Temple, in her distress, did not burn them as completely as she believed. Either way, it suggests the cards themselves may be traceable. Inspector, might I ask whether you noticed anything distinctive about the paper stock? Slack picked up one of the envelopes and held it to the light. Good quality. The sort of thing a funeral director would keep in stock for condolence notices. Precisely. And if you examine the edge of this card, Miss Marple produced a third card from her handbag and indicated a minor irregularity along one side. You can see a very slight burr, as though it had been cut with a guillotine rather than torn or cut with scissors. Cards bought individually from a stationer would have factory-cut edges. These were cut from a larger sheet or stack. The Sick Fund keeps memorial cards, Dolly said suddenly. I remember now. They were purchased in bulk several years ago for sending condolences to bereaved families. And where are those cards kept? Miss Marple asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. In the supplies cupboard at Nurse Eade's clinic room, I believe. It seemed sensible to keep them with the other fund materials. Inspector Slack gathered up the envelopes with newfound purpose. I'll speak to Nurse Eade this afternoon, and I'll want to see those fund records. One more thing. Inspector, Miss Marple said as he prepared to depart, I wonder if you might make inquiries at the telephone exchange. I should like to know if any calls were made to Mr. Vale's establishment on the evenings of Mr. Brackley's and Miss Denham's deaths, and if so, from which telephone box they originated. Slack paused at the door. You think someone called the undertaker before the deaths occurred? I think someone wished to appear prepared, Miss Marple said. Preparedness can seem like prescience to the casual observer. After the inspector had left, Dolly turned to her old friend with mingled admiration and concern. Jane, you're pursuing this as though you're certain of murder. But what if you're wrong? What if these really are just unfortunate coincidences? Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles moving with their customary rhythm. There is a saying, Dolly, that once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, and 3 times is enemy action. We have had 2 deaths at precisely predicted times. I do not intend to wait for a 3rd before taking precautions. She glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. If you will excuse me, I believe I shall pay a visit to the parish hall. I understand Nurse Mead conducts a weekly clinic there on Wednesday afternoons, and I find myself in need of advice about a small matter of first aid supplies for the church bazaar. You're going to investigate her directly. I am going to observe, Miss Marple corrected with a gentle smile. Observation, my dear Dolly, is not the same thing as accusation, but it very often leads to illumination. She gathered her things and departed, leaving Lady Bantry staring thoughtfully at the empty teacups and wondering, not for the first time, how her elderly friend managed to make detective work seem as natural and domestic as arranging flowers or planning a menu. Outside, the November wind scattered leaves across the path, and somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a church clock chimed the hour. Miss Marple walked with her usual brisk pace, her sharp eyes missing nothing, her mind already cataloging the questions she would ask and the answers she hoped to find. 9 days until the 29th. 8 days now by the afternoon light. Time, she reflected, was both the mystery subject and its constraint. Someone in this village understood time very well indeed, its measurement, its manipulation, and its terrible power when wielded by calculating hands. Chapter 4. Orange Pith on a Towel. The parish hall clinic room occupied a small annex at the eastern end of the building, fitted out with the modest efficiency that characterized all of Nurse Mead's professional arrangements, a narrow examination table, a glass-fronted cabinet containing bandages and bottles, a small desk piled with forms and ledgers. Everything spoke of practical competence rather than luxury. Miss Marple arrived at 2, armed with an inquiry about suitable contents for a first aid kit that the Mothers' Union wished to assemble for the church bazaar. It was the sort of question that could not be dismissed out of hand, and Nurse Mead, for all her briskness, was too conscientious to turn away a reasonable request. Of course. Miss Marple, the nurse said, gesturing to a chair. Though I must say I'm surprised the Mothers' Union hasn't simply purchased a ready-made kit. Far more sensible. Oh, but people do like to feel they've assembled something themselves, Miss Marple replied. It gives them a sense of participation, you know. And of course one must be sure to include the proper items. I thought perhaps you might advise me on the essentials. As Nurse Mead launched into a practiced recitation of bandages, antiseptic, and adhesive plasters, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to wander about the room with apparent casualness. The cabinet held the expected array of medical supplies: iodine, gauze, scissors, a rack of small glass vials with rubber stoppers. On the shelf nearest the window sat a collection of what appeared to be insulin preparations, their labels facing outward in neat military order. And one should certainly include safety pins, Nurse Mead was saying. Indispensable for securing bandages properly. Now, if you'll just give me a moment, I'll write out a complete list for you. She moved to her desk, and Miss Marple, seizing the opportunity, rose as though to stretch her legs. Might I trouble you for a bit of soap, nurse? I seem to have acquired some dirt on my hands from the walk over. The hedges are so dusty this time of year. Of course. The basin is just there, and you'll find the towel on the roller. Miss Marple made her way to the small sink in the corner, noting as she did so the careful organization of everything within reach. This was a woman who knew where each item belonged, and could locate it in darkness if necessary, the hallmark of long professional training. As she dried her hands on the roller towel, Miss Marple's keen eyes registered something that would have escaped a less observant visitor. Caught in the fabric's weave were several tiny flecks of orange, not the bright orange of a child's toy or a knitted garment, but the paler, fibrous orange of citrus pith. And there, in the waste bin beside the basin, lay the source, an orange peel split and wrinkled, bearing two small puncture marks remarkably close together. "There we are," Nurse Eade said, holding out a sheet of paper covered in her firm handwriting. "Everything you'll need for a proper first aid kit. I've included quantities as well." "How very thorough of you," Miss Marple said, returning to accept the list. "I'm sure the ladies will be most grateful. You're always so generous with your time and expertise." "It's my job to help where I can," the nurse replied, though there was a hint of complacency in her tone. Poor Ruth Denham. Now, if only she'd been more careful with her insulin doses, she might still be with us. I tried to teach her proper technique, but some people simply don't have the aptitude for such things. "How very sad," Miss Marple murmured. "I understand diabetes requires considerable discipline. Indeed it does. The balance between insulin and diet must be maintained precisely. Too much insulin and one risks hypoglycemia, a dangerous drop in blood sugar. Too little or missing doses entirely, and the opposite occurs. Ruth, I'm afraid, was careless. She would forget her injections or take them at irregular times. Did she administer them herself?" "Oh, yes. We teach all diabetic patients to manage their own care. I supervised her at first, naturally, and I would check her technique from time to time. But one can't be with patients every moment of the day." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "I suppose you practice on, what is it? Oranges? I believe I read somewhere that medical people use oranges to learn injection techniques." Nurse Eade smiled slightly. "You're quite right. The skin provides resistance similar to human tissue, and the fruit is expendable. I often demonstrate for family members who need to learn how to give injections. In fact, I was just reviewing the technique this morning. One of Mrs. Hartwell's daughters wished to know how to administer her mother's tonic injections should the need arise." "Mrs. Hartwell takes injections?" Miss Marple asked with innocent interest. "Vitamin supplements, primarily B12, for energy, that sort of thing. Dr. Haydock prescribes them for several of his elderly patients. Nothing complicated, but family members often worry about causing pain or doing it incorrectly." Miss Marple accepted this explanation with a nod, though her mind was cataloging the information with the precision of a filing clock. B12 injections. Insulin demonstrations. Orange peels with practice punctures. Her attention shifted to the glass-fronted cabinet where the row of vials caught the afternoon light. Most appeared identical, their contents clear and unremarkable. But one vial, smaller than the others, showed a peculiar feature, a faint blue ring at the liquid surface, as though something in its composition refracted light differently from its companions. "What an impressive array of supplies you maintain," Miss Marple observed. "I confess I wouldn't know what half of them are for." Nurse Eade followed her gaze. "Oh, most are quite mundane. Sterile water for diluting medications, various antiseptics, a few emergency supplies. The insulin preparations are kept separate, of course. One can't be too careful with those." She moved to adjust something on her desk, and in that moment, Miss Marple noticed that she turned the cabinet's key with practiced ease, locking it without appearing to give the action any conscious thought. "Well, I mustn't keep you from your work any longer," Miss Marple said, gathering her handbag and the list of first aid supplies. "You've been most helpful, nurse. The Mothers' Union will be delighted." "Not at all," Do give my regards to the vicar and Mrs. Clement." As Miss Marple made her way out of the parish hall, she encountered Oswald Raikes just entering. He was a sleek man in his late 40s, dressed with more attention to style than was quite usual for St. Mary Mead. His profession as an insurance agent had given him a certain smooth manner and a habit of smiling with his mouth while his eyes calculated. "Miss Marple?" "Good afternoon," he said, tipping his hat. "Consulting our excellent nurse, I trust." "Merely seeking advice for the church bazaar," Miss Marple replied. "And you, Mr. Raikes?" Just calling about the sick comfort fund accounts. Nurse Eade has been kind enough to ask my opinion on the best way to invest the fund's reserves. A small matter, but one likes to ensure charitable money is well managed." "How very public-spirited of you," Miss Marple said. She walked home slowly, her mind turning over what she'd observed. Orange pith on a towel, puncture marks in fruit peel, a vial with a curious blue ring that set it apart from its fellows, and Nurse Eade's confident assertion that Ruth Denham had been careless with her insulin, when everything Miss Marple knew of Ruth suggested a woman who lived in careful consciousness of her condition. 2 methods for 2 deaths, she thought. One man who was not diabetic, dead of what might have been an insulin overdose disguised as heart failure. One woman who was diabetic, dead of what might have been insulin withheld or replaced, ketoacidosis from missing doses. Both deaths natural in appearance. Both deaths occurring at precisely predicted times along a district nurse's predictable route. "If you will excuse me, I believe I shall pay a visit to the parish hall. I understand Nurse Eade conducts a weekly clinic there on Wednesday afternoons, and I find myself in need of advice about a small matter of first aid supplies for the church bazaar. You're going to investigate her directly." "I am going to observe," Miss Marple corrected with a gentle smile. "Observation, my dear Dolly, is not the same thing as accusation, but it very often leads to illumination." She gathered her things and departed, leaving Lady Bantry staring thoughtfully at the empty teacups and wondering, not for the first time, how her elderly friend managed to make detective work seem as natural and domestic as arranging flowers or planning a menu. Outside, the November wind scattered leaves across the path, and somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a church clock chimed the hour. Miss Marple walked with her usual brisk pace, her sharp eyes missing nothing, her mind already cataloging the questions she would ask and the answers she hoped to find. 9 days until the 29th, 8 days now by the afternoon light. Time, she reflected, was both the mystery's subject and its constraint. Someone in this village understood time very well indeed, its measurement, its manipulation, and its terrible power when wielded by calculating hands. Chapter 4. Orange pith on a towel. The parish hall clinic room occupied a small annex at the eastern end of the building, fitted out with the modest efficiency that characterized all of Nurse Eade's professional arrangements. A narrow examination table, a glass-fronted cabinet containing bandages and bottles, a small desk piled with forms and ledgers. Everything spoke of practical competence rather than luxury. Miss Marple arrived at 2, armed with an inquiry about suitable contents for a first aid kit that the Mothers' Union wished to assemble for the church bazaar. It was the sort of question that could not be dismissed out of hand, and Nurse Eade, for all her briskness, was too conscientious to turn away a reasonable request. "Of course, Miss Marple," the nurse said, gesturing to a chair. "Though I must say I'm surprised the Mothers' Union hasn't simply purchased a ready-made kit. Far more sensible." "Oh, but people do like to feel they've assembled something themselves," Miss Marple replied. "It gives them a sense of participation, you know. And of course one must be sure to include the proper items. I thought perhaps you might advise me on the essentials." As Nurse Eade launched into a practiced recitation of bandages, antiseptic and adhesive plasters, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to wander about the room with apparent casualness. The cabinet held the expected array of medical supplies: iodine, gauze, scissors, a rack of small glass vials with rubber stoppers. On the shelf nearest the window sat a collection of what appeared to be insulin preparations, their labels facing outward in neat military order. And one should certainly include safety pins, Nurse Ide was saying, indispensable for securing bandages properly. Now, if you'll just give me a moment, I'll write out a complete list for you. She moved to her desk, and Miss Marple, seizing the opportunity, rose as though to stretch her legs. Might I trouble you for a bit of soap, nurse? I seem to have acquired some dirt on my hands from the walk over. The hedges are so dusty this time of year. Of course. The basin is just there, and you'll find the towel on the roller. Miss Marple made her way to the small sink in the corner, noting as she did so the careful organization of everything within reach. This was a woman who knew where each item belonged, and could locate it in darkness if necessary, the hallmark of long professional training. As she dried her hands on the roller towel, Miss Marple's keen eyes registered something that would have escaped a less observant visitor. Caught in the fabric's weave were several tiny flecks of orange, not the bright orange of a child's toy or a knitted garment, but the paler fibrous orange of citrus pith. And there, in the waste bin beside the basin, lay the source, an orange peel, split and wrinkled, bearing two small puncture marks remarkably close together. There we are, Nurse Ede said, holding out a sheet of paper covered in her firm handwriting. Everything you'll need for a proper first aid kit. I've included quantities as well. How very thorough of you, Miss Marple said, returning to accept the list. I'm sure the ladies will be most grateful. You're always so generous with your time and expertise. It's my job to help where I can, the nurse replied, though there was a hint of complacency in her tone. Poor Ruth Denham. Now, if only she'd been more careful with her insulin doses, she might still be with us. I tried to teach her proper technique, but some people simply don't have the aptitude for such things. How very sad, Miss Marple murmured. I understand diabetes requires considerable discipline. Indeed it does. The balance between insulin and diet must be maintained precisely. Too much insulin and one risks hypoglycemia, a dangerous drop in blood sugar. Too little or missing doses entirely, and the opposite occurs. Ruth, I'm afraid, was careless. She would forget her injections or take them at irregular times. Did she administer them herself? Oh, yes. We teach all diabetic patients to manage their own care. I supervised her at first, naturally, and I would check her technique from time to time, but one can't be with patients every moment of the day. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. I suppose you practice on, what is it? Oranges? I believe I read somewhere that medical people use oranges to learn injection techniques. Nurse Ede smiled slightly. You're quite right. The skin provides resistance similar to human tissue, and the fruit is expendable. I often demonstrate for family members who need to learn how to give injections. In fact, I was just reviewing the technique this morning. One of Mrs. Hartwell's daughters wished to know how to administer her mother's tonic injections should the need arise. Mrs. Hartwell takes injections? Miss Marple asked with innocent interest. Vitamin supplements, primarily B12 for energy, that sort of thing. Dr. Haydock prescribes them for several of his elderly patients. Nothing complicated. But family members often worry about causing pain or doing it incorrectly. Miss Marple accepted this explanation with a nod, though her mind was cataloging the information with the precision of a filing clock. B12 injections. Insulin demonstrations. Orange peels with practice punctures. Her attention shifted to the glass-fronted cabinet where the row of vials caught the afternoon light. Most appeared identical, their contents clear and unremarkable. But one vial, smaller than the others, showed a peculiar feature. a faint blue ring at the liquid surface, as though something in its composition refracted light differently from its companions. "What an impressive array of supplies you maintain," Miss Marple observed. "I confess I wouldn't know what half of them are for." Nurse Eade followed her gaze. "Oh, most are quite mundane. Sterile water for diluting medications, various antiseptics, a few emergency supplies. The insulin preparations are kept separate, of course. One can't be too careful with those." She moved to adjust something on her desk, and in that moment, Miss Marple noticed that she turned the cabinet's key with practiced ease, locking it without appearing to give the action any conscious thought. "Well, I mustn't keep you from your work any longer," Miss Marple said, gathering her handbag and the list of first aid supplies. "You've been most helpful, nurse. The Mothers' Union will be delighted." "Not at all. Do give my regards to the vicar and Mrs. Clement." As Miss Marple made her way out of the parish hall, she encountered Oswald Raikes just entering. He was a sleek man in his late 40s, dressed with more attention to style than was quite usual for St. Mary Mead. His profession as an insurance agent had given him a certain smooth manner and a habit of smiling with his mouth while his eyes calculated. "Miss Marple? Good afternoon," he said, tipping his hat. "Consulting our excellent nurse, I trust?" "Merely seeking advice for the church bazaar," Miss Marple replied. "And you, Mr. Raikes?" "Ah, just calling about the sick comfort fund accounts. Nurse Eade has been kind enough to ask my opinion on the best way to invest the fund's reserves. A small matter, but one likes to ensure charitable money is well managed." "How very public-spirited of you," Miss Marple said. She walked home slowly, her mind turning over what she'd observed. Orange pith on a towel, puncture marks in fruit peel, a vial with a curious blue ring that set it apart from its fellows, and Nurse Eade's confident assertion that Ruth Denham had been careless with her insulin, when everything Miss Marple knew of Ruth suggested a woman who lived in careful consciousness of her condition. 2 methods for 2 deaths, she thought. One man who was not diabetic, dead of what might have been an insulin overdose disguised as heart failure. One woman who was diabetic, dead of what might have been insulin withheld or replaced, ketoacidosis from missing doses. Both deaths natural in appearance. Both deaths occurring at precisely predicted times along a district nurse's predictable route. At home, Miss Marple opened her notebook and made several careful entries. Then she reached for her telephone and asked the operator to connect her with Dr. Haydock's surgery. There were questions that needed answers, and time was pressing forward with inexorable certainty toward the 29th of the month, 7 days now. 7 days to unmask a killer who worked with needles and timing and who hid behind the screen of an innocent widow's supposed second sight. Chapter 5. The Widow's Book of Days, Mrs. Temple's sitting room possessed that particular quality of stillness that comes to houses inhabited by solitary women who have long since established their routines and see no reason to alter them. The furniture was old but well maintained, the curtains faded but scrupulously clean, and everywhere there was evidence of that determined tidiness that serves as armor against the encroachments of loneliness. Miss Marple had called the following morning, ostensibly to return a borrowed pattern book, but in reality to pursue certain observations that had occurred to her during a wakeful night. Mrs. Temple received her with the mingled relief and apprehension of someone who has found an ally, but fears what that alliance might reveal. "I've been going through everything," the widow said, gesturing to a small pile of papers on the table. "Inspector Slack asked me to gather the sick comfort fund receipts for the past year. I deliver them to Nurse Eade each month, you see, and she signs them after checking against her rounds. It's all been quite proper, or so I thought. But now I find myself questioning everything. May I look at your almanac again?" Miss Marple asked gently. I should like to study those penciled crosses more. Carefully, in better light, Mrs. Temple fetched the red-bound volume from the mantelpiece and handed it over with visible reluctance. Miss Marple carried it to the window where the morning sun provided excellent illumination and opened it to the marked pages. The crosses were there as before, but as Miss Marple studied them, a pattern began to emerge that had nothing to do with deaths or predictions. She reached into her handbag and produced the list of dates she had copied from the Sick Comfort Fund receipt book during her visit to the vicarage. Earlier that week, visits that Griselda Clement had been happy to share, thinking Miss Marple merely wished to understand the fund's operations. Mrs. Temple, she said slowly, on what days does Nurse Eade typically visit Mrs. Hartwell at the lodge? Why, Tuesdays and Fridays, I believe. She changes dressings for Mrs. Hartwell's leg ulcers. The poor woman has circulation problems. Miss Marple consulted the almanac again. The penciled crosses fell precisely on Tuesdays and Fridays throughout the autumn months. And Mr. Rakes, when does he make his insurance collections? Thursdays? Always Thursdays. He's very particular about his schedule. Miss Marple turned to the relevant pages. Additional marks appeared on Thursday dates, fainter but discernible. Someone has been tracking movements, she said quietly. Not predicting deaths, but recording the regular patterns of people who move through St. Mary Mead on fixed schedules. These marks show when the nurse visits Mrs. Hartwell and when the insurance agent makes his rounds. Mrs. Temple's face went white. But who would do such a thing? And why here, in my almanac? Because your almanac sits openly on your mantelpiece, visible to any visitor. And because, my dear, you're known to be a timid woman who would not challenge someone with authority or professional standing. If questioned about the marks, you would assume you had made them yourself and forgotten, or you would blame your own failing memory. Rather than accuse a visitor of tampering, Miss Marple moved to the coal scuttle and knelt beside it with surprising agility for a woman of her years. Among the cold dust and fragments, she found what she was seeking, a torn corner of black-edged cardstock, cleanly severed as though by a sharp blade. You said you burned all the threatening cards immediately, Miss Marple observed. Yet here is a piece of one. It did not tear, the edges too perfect. It was cut, almost certainly by a paper, guillotine of the sort used for trimming stacks of cards or preparing stationery. She produced a small envelope from her bag and carefully deposited the fragment within it. There's something else, Mrs. Temple said hesitantly. She crossed to the writing desk and opened a drawer. I found this yesterday, caught in the hinge of the coal scuttle lid. I don't know what to make of it. It was a small twist of blue paper, the sort used to seal medical supplies. The gum surface still showed traces of adhesive. A syringe box seal, Miss Marple said with quiet satisfaction. Fresh enough that the gum remains tacky. This did not come from your household, did it? No, I have no occasion to use such things. Miss Marple sat down and regarded the widow with compassionate directness. Mrs. Temple, I must ask you to think carefully. Has anyone visited you in recent weeks who might have had opportunity to mark your almanac and leave these items in your coal scuttle? Well, Nurse Eade calls sometimes with the sick fund papers, and Mr. Rakes stopped by once to discuss a small policy matter. The vicar and his wife, of course, but I cannot imagine. When did Nurse Eade last visit? She came 3 days before Mr. Brackley died. She brought the signed receipts and we had tea. I remember because I stepped out briefly to answer the door for a delivery, and when I returned, she was standing by the fireplace. I thought nothing of it at the time. And the almanac was on the mantelpiece then? Yes, always. I consult it daily for my household routines. Miss Marple nodded slowly. A picture was forming in her mind, drawn from fragments of evidence that individually meant little, but together sketched the outline of a deliberate and calculating mind. Mrs. Temple, I believe someone has been using your home as a workshop of sorts, not for any physical construction, but for the creation of an atmosphere. The marks in your almanac were made by someone tracking their own movements and opportunities. The torn card fragment and the syringe seal were left accidentally, or in haste. And your coal scuttle, with its lid that opens and closes frequently, provided a convenient hiding place for burning evidence. Evidence that was never entirely consumed? But why? Mrs. Temple's voice trembled. Why involve me at all? Because you are kind, retiring, and trusted. Because you maintain the sick fund records, and thus have connection to both the nurse and the fund's benefactors. And because I suspect you were never meant to keep those threatening cards or to show them to anyone. You were meant to whisper your presentiments based on them, then destroy the evidence, leaving only village gossip about your uncanny knowledge. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street. Someone underestimated you, my dear. They expected you to be frightened into secrecy, or into playing the role of a village oracle. They did not expect you to seek help or to preserve evidence. That miscalculation may prove to be their undoing. She turned back to face the widow. Now, I should like to see the receipts you've prepared for this month, particularly any that involve Mrs. Hartwell's account. Mrs. Temple gathered the papers with shaking hands. As Miss Marple examined them, her expression grew increasingly grave. The receipts showed regular payments from Mrs. Hartwell's account to the sick fund, but the amounts varied in ways that seemed inconsistent with the stated purpose of the fund. Has Mrs. Hartwell ever questioned these accounts? Miss Marple asked. Not to me directly, but I overheard her speaking with her solicitor last week when I delivered some correspondence to the lodge. She said something about wanting to review the fund's books before finalizing her new will. She seemed concerned about irregularities. Miss Marple's hand stilled on the papers. When is Mrs. Hartwell's will to be signed? The 30th, I believe. The day after, Mrs. Temple stopped, her face going ashen. The day after the predicted date of her death, Miss Marple finished quietly. How very convenient for someone who might have reason to prevent that review, and that new will. She gathered the receipts and the fragments of evidence with methodical care. Mrs. Temple, you must promise me something. You will not be alone in this house after dark until this matter is resolved. Can you stay with the Clements at the vicarage? But surely I'm not in danger. The cards predicted others, not me. You possess knowledge now, Miss Marple said. You have seen patterns that someone worked carefully to conceal. That makes you dangerous to a person who has already killed twice to protect secrets. The widow nodded mutely. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she paused at the door. One more question. The black-edged cards kept for the sick fund, where are they stored? In the supplies cupboard at Nurse Eade's clinic. We ordered a bulk quantity years ago. They seemed appropriately dignified for condolence notes to bereaved families. Thank you, Miss Marple said. That confirms what I suspected. Miss Marple accepted the pamphlet and studied the illustrations. The blue ring appeared as a faint line at the meniscus of the liquid in the vial, subtle enough not to contaminate the solution, but visible enough to prevent confusion. And this sterile water, what would one use it for? Diluting concentrated insulin preparations primarily. Some patients require very small doses, which are difficult to measure accurately from standard concentrations. One draws the insulin into the syringe, then adds sterile water to achieve the proper dilution. The blue ring ensures one doesn't accidentally inject plain water, thinking it's insulin. How dreadful that would be, Miss Marple murmured. If a diabetic patient injected water instead of insulin, what would happen? They would miss their dose entirely. Depending on when they realize the error, it could lead to elevated blood sugar. In severe cases, ketoacidosis, which can be life-threatening if not treated promptly. And if someone administered undiluted insulin to a person who wasn't diabetic? Pratt's expression grew serious. That would be extremely dangerous. Hypoglycemia, dangerously low blood sugar, would result. Confusion, sweating, rapid heartbeat, possibly seizures or loss of consciousness. In elderly patients with heart conditions, it could easily prove fatal. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. I suppose these products are carefully controlled. One couldn't simply purchase insulin or these diluents without a prescription? Absolutely not. Insulin requires a doctor's prescription, and we maintain strict records of all dispensations. The diluents are likewise controlled. They're distributed only to medical professionals for use with their patients. Would a district nurse have access to such supplies? Certainly. Nurses order various medical supplies through my shop regularly. She has standing authorization from Dr. Haydock to maintain a stock of items needed for her rounds. Insulin for emergencies, sterile water, bandages, antiseptics, all perfectly proper and above board. Of course, Miss Marple said gently. I'm sure it is. Tell me, Mr. Pratt, has Nurse Eade ordered any of these blue ring diluents recently? The chemist consulted his order book. She requested a box of 6 ampules 3 weeks ago. Said she wanted to have them available for teaching purposes, demonstrating proper dilution technique to patients' families. Very conscientious of her. And these ampules, once opened, how long do they remain sterile? They should be used immediately after opening. The seal is broken when the needle penetrates the rubber stopper, and sterility cannot be guaranteed after that point. Miss Marple thanked him and departed with the pamphlet tucked into her handbag. Her next call was to Dr. Haydock's surgery, where she found the doctor between appointments, and willing to indulge what he clearly regarded as an elderly lady's morbid curiosity about medical matters. Ruth Denham's death troubles me, Miss Marple said without preamble. You said it was ketoacidosis from neglected insulin, but Ruth was such a careful woman about her condition. Haydock sighed. I thought so too, but the evidence was clear. Her blood sugar was dangerously elevated, and her breath had that characteristic fruity odor of ketoacidosis. She must have been missing doses for at least a day or two. Did you examine her insulin supply? I did. The bottle was half full, which suggested she hadn't been using it. But what struck me as odd, he paused, frowning at the memory, was that her syringe was clean. Spotless, in fact, as though it had just been washed. And in her medical kit, I found 2 empty ampules, 1 insulin, which was correct, and 1 blue ring diluent. Could she have been diluting her doses? She had no reason to. Her prescription was already at the proper concentration, and if she had been diluting, I would have expected to find partially used ampules, not 2 empty ones. It made no medical sense. Unless, Miss Marple said slowly, someone drew out her insulin and replaced it with sterile water from the diluent ampule. Ruth would have administered what she believed was her proper dose, but received nothing. The insulin bottle would still appear half full because the volume hadn't changed, only the contents. Haydock stared at her. That would be murder. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. I rather think it would. She told him about the blue-ringed vial she'd observed in Nurse Eade's cabinet, about the orange pith with puncture marks, about the pattern of deaths following warnings that aligned too precisely with medical rounds to be coincidental. Good God, Haydock breathed, horrified. But she's devoted her life to caring for people. Some people, Miss Marple observed, convince themselves that their service entitles them to exceptions from ordinary morality, and when their position is threatened, they protect it by any means necessary. She rose to leave. Doctor, Mrs. Hartwell is scheduled to die on the 29th at 9. I suspect the method will be similar to Mr. Brackley's, a large insulin dose disguised as something innocuous. You must be prepared to counteract it immediately should the attack occur. I'll be there, Haydock promised grimly. And I'll bring glucose solution and everything else needed to reverse hypoglycemia. As Miss Marple walked home, the pieces were falling into final alignment. The blue-ringed vial held the key to Ruth Denham's death. The tap marks on Ruth's insulin bottle, marks Dr. Haydock would surely have noted, showed where a second needle had entered to draw off the insulin and replace it with sterile water. 2 ways to kill with 1 skill. Too much insulin for those who didn't need it. Too little for those who did. And both methods perfectly suited to a district nurse who moved through the village on predictable rounds, trusted and above. Suspicion, timing medical crises to match her own fabricated prophecies. 4 days until the PAL. 29th. 4 days to ensure that when Nurse I'd made her final calculated move, Miss Marple and Inspector Slack would be ready to stop her. Chapter 8. A Letter. Walks the nurse's route. The telephone exchange occupied a small room above the post office, a cramped space filled with plugs and cords and the constant clicking of connections being made and broken. Miss Ivy Debenham, the supervisor, presided over this domain with the quiet authority of someone who knows everyone's business and is discreet about most of it. When Miss Marple called on Monday afternoon, bearing a small pot of her famous gooseberry jam as a gift, Ivy received her with pleasure. They were not intimates, but there existed between them the mutual respect of women who observed much and spoke carefully. Miss Marple, how kind of you. Do sit down, though. I'm afraid the chair is rather wobbly. We're always promising ourselves new furniture, but somehow it never materializes. I shan't trouble you from your work, Miss Marple assured her. I merely wanted to thank you for your patience last week when the line to Gossington was so troublesome. Static, you know. Oh, that's quite all right. These old connections can be temperamental in damp weather. Miss Marple settled herself and arranged her skirts with that fussy precision that often preceded her most pointed observations. I wonder if I might ask your advice on a small matter. It's somewhat delicate. Ivy's expression sharpened with interest, of course, Inspector. Slack mentioned that there were telephone calls made to Mr. Vale's establishment on the evenings when Mr. Brackley and Miss Denham died. Anonymous calls, apparently from the kiosk near the parish hall. I believe you might have logged them. I did notice them, Ivy admitted cautiously. Both at exactly 10 minutes to 8, which struck me as odd. The same time on 2 different evenings, you see, and the same location. Yes, the parish hall kiosk has a distinctive ring. I can always tell which box a call originates from. These were definitely from that location. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Did you happen to notice who passed the parish hall at that hour? I understand your window overlooks the green. Ivy hesitated, then seemed to reach a decision. Miss Marple, I've been troubled about this. On both evenings, I saw Nurse Eade's bicycle near the hall steps just before 8. She often stops there on her rounds. There's a water tap by the entrance that she uses for washing her hands or cleaning instruments. I saw her there at approximately 7:45 both times. And the calls to Mr. Vale came at 7:50. Yes. Now, I'm not saying the nurse made those calls, it could have been anyone, but the timing struck me as curious. And when Inspector Slack made his inquiries, I felt obliged to mention what I'd observed. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Miss Debenham, you understand the telephone system better than anyone in the village. If someone wished to disguise their voice on such a call, how might they do it? A handkerchief over the mouthpiece works tolerably well, or simply speaking in a whisper. The quality of the connection from those outdoor kiosks is poor enough that any disguise would be effective. And the purpose of calling an undertaker before a death has been officially discovered? Ivy's voice dropped. I've thought about that. If you wish to appear prescient, To seem as though you knew death was coming, you might alert the undertaker in advance. Then, when the death is discovered shortly afterward, people remember that Vale seemed unusually prepared. It reinforces the idea that someone had special knowledge. "How very perceptive of you," Miss Marple said warmly. "That is exactly what I suspected." She paused, then added, "There's another matter. The warning cards sent to Mrs. Temple were all posted at the 515 collection from the parish hall box. I understand you can see that post box from your window as well." "I can. And Miss Marple, I did observe Nurse Eade posting letters there on 2 occasions in recent weeks. Once on the Monday before Mr. Brackley died, once on the Monday before Miss Denham, both times at approximately 5:18, just as she was leaving the hall after asking for water. Did you see what she posted?" "No, I couldn't see that clearly, but she stood at the box for a moment, as though checking an address before dropping the letters in." Miss Marple absorbed this information with satisfaction. The pattern was complete. The nurse's route took her past the post box at exactly the time needed to catch the 5:15 collection, and past the telephone kiosk at exactly the time the anonymous calls were made. "One last question," Miss Marple said. "Has Mrs. Hartwell been receiving any unusual calls recently?" Ivy frowned. "Now that you mention it, she received a call last Thursday from someone claiming to be from her solicitor's office. But when I connected a return call Friday morning at her request, the solicitor said they'd made no such call." Mrs. Hartwell was quite upset. She thought someone was prying into her business affairs. "Testing her schedule," Miss Marple murmured, determining when she would be at home and vulnerable. She rose to leave, and Ivy walked her to the door of the exchange office. "Miss Marple," Ivy said quietly, "I know what you're doing. I know what you suspect. And I want you to know that if you need me to testify to what I've seen, I will. Nurse Eade has done good work in this village, but if she's done what you believe, then no amount of past service can excuse it. Thank you, my dear. Your courage does you credit." As Miss Marple descended the narrow stairs to the street, she reflected on the accumulation of evidence. Each piece individually might be explained away: a nurse posting letters during her rounds, stopping at a water tap, passing a telephone kiosk. But the pattern, when viewed whole, told a story of calculated planning and meticulous timing. The warning cards bore die-cut edges from the guillotine stack kept in the nurse's locked cupboard. They were posted from the box on her route at times when she was observed nearby. The anonymous calls came from a kiosk she passed at predictable hours. The deaths themselves occurred along the schedule of her district rounds, timed with medical precision to match the predictions, and at the center of it all, a woman who had convinced herself that her service to the Ash village justified theft and that murder was an acceptable price for maintaining her position and concealing her crimes. 3 days until the Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where she had arranged to meet Inspector Slack. It was time to coordinate their final preparations. Mrs. Hartwell must be protected. The trap must be set. And when Nurse Ed made her move at 9 on the predicted evening, they must be ready to expose not just the attempted murder, but the entire architecture of deception that had preceded it. The end game was at hand, and Miss Marple had no intention of allowing a third death to fulfill its terrible prophecy. She thought of Mrs. Temple, trembling and frightened, used as an unwitting screen for murder. She thought of Mr. Brackley and Ruth Denham, killed to protect secrets that would have unraveled at the first serious investigation. And she thought of Nurse Phyllis Eade, who had chosen to be judge and executioner rather than face the consequences of her own dishonesty. "Comfort is not a license," Miss Marple said softly to herself as she entered the vicarage gate. "And our telling belongs to clocks, not to those who would play at being fate." The time for observation was ending. The time for action had come. Chapter 9. Snow on the Lich Gate, a Third Warning. The 29th dawned cold and clear, with frost on the windows and a particular quality to the air that suggested snow before nightfall. Miss Marple rose early, her mind already running through the arrangements that had been made with Inspector Slack and Dr. Haydock. Mrs. Hartwell had been informed of the danger she faced, and while initially skeptical, the evidence presented had convinced her to cooperate with the plan to expose her would-be murderer. At Hartwell Lodge, a constable had been posted in the morning under the pretext of investigating a reported burglary in the A neighborhood. Dr. Haydock had called, ostensibly, to check on Mrs. Hartwell's circulation problems, but in reality to be present should a medical emergency arise. And Oswald Rakes had been summoned to bring papers for Mrs. Hartwell to review, though not to sign, despite what he might believe. Miss Marple herself arrived at the lodge at tea time, bringing a small basket of scones and the excuse of a social call. Mrs. Hartwell, a handsome woman in her 70s with shrewd eyes and an imperious manner, received her in the drawing room with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. Miss Marple, I confess I still find it difficult to believe that Nurse Mead would wish me harm. She has attended me faithfully these 2 years. That is precisely what makes her dangerous, Miss Marple replied gently. Trust is the weapon she has wielded most effectively, but the evidence is quite conclusive. Mrs. Hartwell, the sick fund accounts show consistent discrepancies, money withdrawn ostensibly for supplies that were never purchased. Your plan to review the books and alter your will threatened to expose her theft. And you believe she killed poor Mr. Brackley and Ruth Denham to prevent them from revealing her crimes? Mr. Brackley saw her alter an entry in the district visiting book, changing a time to create an alibi, I suspect. Ruth complained about unusual injection reactions and threatened to speak with Dr. Haydock. Both became dangerous to her continued deception. Mrs. Hartwell shuddered. To think I welcomed her into my home. The afternoon wore on with agonizing slowness. Miss Marple occupied herself with needlework, her fingers moving mechanically, while her mind remained alert to every sound, every shadow beyond the windows. Dr. Haydock sat with a medical journal, though Miss Marple noticed he never turned the pages. The constable remained in the hall, positioned to observe anyone approaching the drawing room. At 9:05, Oswald Rakes arrived with his portfolio of papers. He was all solicitude and professional smoothness, expressing concern for Mrs. Hartwell's health and assuring her that the documents required only the briefest review. Nothing to be signed tonight. Of course, he said. Tomorrow will be soon enough for that, when you're feeling quite yourself. Miss Marple noted the emphasis. Rakes expected Mrs. Hartwell to be indisposed by tomorrow. Expected, perhaps, that she would not live to sign any documents at all. At 9:20, there came a knock at the door, and Nurse Mead entered with her familiar brisk efficiency. She carried her medical bag and wore her customary professional smile. Good evening, Mrs. Hartwell. I've brought your sleep draft, as prescribed by Dr. Haydock, chloral mixed to the proper strength. It should help you rest comfortably tonight. She produced a small medicine glass containing a clear liquid and held it out to Mrs. Hartwell. Dr. Haydock rose from his chair. Just a moment, nurse. I don't recall prescribing a sleep draft for Mrs. Hartwell. Nurse Mead's expression flickered with something that might have been alarm, quickly suppressed. Why, doctor, you mentioned it last week when I made my report. Mrs. Hartwell complained of restless nights. I suggested warm milk, and perhaps a small amount of brandy. I certainly did not prescribe chloral. I must have misunderstood, the nurse said smoothly, but her hand, holding the medicine glass, had begun to tremble slightly. Miss Marple spoke from her chair by the fire. I wonder, Nurse Mead, if Dr. Haydock might examine the contents of that glass? Professional verification, you understand. Given the unfortunate deaths we've experienced recently, One cannot be too careful. The nurse's face went rigid. I assure you. Miss Marple, I know how to prepare a simple sleep draft. Nevertheless, I should like to see it, Dr. Haydock said, extending his hand. For a moment, Nurse Ide seemed poised between compliance and flight. Then, with a sudden movement, she dashed the contents of the glass into the fireplace. The liquid hissed against the hot coals. How clumsy of me, she said, her voice tight. I shall have to prepare another dose. That won't be necessary, Inspector Slack said, stepping into the room from the doorway where he had been concealed. Nurse. Phyllis Ide, I am placing you under arrest on suspicion of the murders of Amos Brackley and Ruth Denham and the attempted murder of Mrs. Edith Hartwell. The nurse stood frozen, her medical bag clutched against her chest like a shield. Then slowly her shoulders sagged. I kept them comfortable, she said, her voice barely audible. All those years of service, the village would have starved or sickened without me. Mrs. Hartwell would have ruined the fund, destroyed everything I built. You built it with stolen money, Mrs. Hartwell said coldly, and you murdered to keep your secrets safe. Outside, the first snow began to fall, drifting past the windows in soft silence. The church clock struck the half hour, 9:30, the predicted time. And in that moment, Miss Marple saw Nurse Eade's expression transform from defiance to something approaching wonder. The clock, she whispered. It's exactly 9, just as the card said. The church clock runs slow on cold evenings, Miss Marple observed. You knew that, and planned to use it. The actual time is closer to 9:33. You meant to administer your dose, then have Mr. Rakes and the constable as witnesses when Mrs. Hartwell collapsed at the appointed hour. The village would have said it was foretold, just as the others were. Inspector Slack motioned to the constable, who came forward with handcuffs. Wait, Dr. Haydock said. He had retrieved the nurse's medical bag and was examining its contents. His face grew grim as he lifted out a syringe and a vial. This isn't chloral at all. This is insulin, concentrated insulin. The dose prepared here would have been massive, enough to send Mrs. Hartwell into severe hypoglycemia within minutes. If we hadn't intervened, she would have died at exactly 9, Miss Marple finished quietly. Or near enough to satisfy the village that the prophecy had been fulfilled, and everyone would have blamed fate or Mrs. Temple's uncanny knowledge rather than examining the evidence of deliberate murder. Nurse. I'd said nothing more as the constable led her away, but at the door she turned back with a look of such hatred that Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold evening air. You've destroyed me, the nurse said. Everything I worked for. No, my dear, Miss Marple replied with gentle firmness. You destroyed yourself when you chose theft over honesty and murder over confession. I merely ensured you could destroy no one else. After they had gone, Miss Marple remained seated by the fire, watching the snow fall more heavily beyond the windows. It would cover the Lich Gate by midnight, she thought, and blanket the village in white silence. But there would be no third death tonight, no fulfillment of the terrible prophecy, only justice. Measured and certain, catching up at last to a killer who had confused dedication with ownership and service with the right to take life. Thank you, Miss Marple, Mrs. Hartwell said softly. You have saved my life. We all played our parts, Miss Marple said. But I confess I shall be glad when this matter is concluded, and St. Mary Mead can return to its proper tranquility. Outside, the snow continued to fall, pure and silent, covering the traces of a dark autumn with the promise of winter's clean slate. Chapter 10. Parlor. Postmark. Syringa and the Woman Who chose the hour. The Clements' parlor had been chosen for the final gathering, as it so often was, when St. Mary Mead required a venue for the resolution of uncomfortable matters, canon, Clement presided with his usual gentle ineffectuality, while Griselda ensured that tea was available and that everyone had a comfortable seat. It was 3 days after Nurse Eads' arrest, and Inspector Slack had deemed it appropriate to conclude the official inquiry with a complete explanation of the evidence. Those assembled represented the core of village life: Lady Bantry, Mrs. Temple, Mr. Rakes, Ernest Vale, Ivy Debenham, Dr. Haydock, and, of course, Miss Marple herself, seated near the window with her inevitable knitting. Inspector Slack cleared his throat and consulted his notes. "I've asked Miss Marple to provide the explanation," he said with obvious reluctance. "She identified the pattern before any of us recognized there was a crime to investigate." Miss Marple set down her knitting and folded her hands in her lap. "It began with Mrs. Temple receiving anonymous cards predicting death," she said quietly. "But the widow never possessed any supernatural knowledge. The cards were sent to her deliberately, so that when she whispered warnings, as any kind person might, hoping to prevent tragedy, she would appear to have uncanny foresight after the deaths occurred." Mrs. Temple, pale but composed, nodded. "I never wanted anyone to think I was claiming special powers. I only wanted to warn people, without showing them those dreadful cards." "The cards themselves told a story," Miss Marple continued. "Though written in 3 different hands to disguise authorship, they shared telling consistencies. The spacing between certain words remained identical. The stamps were always tilted at the same angle, and one envelope bore a faint oily residue consistent with the hand cream that nurses use after frequent washing." She reached into her handbag and produced the envelopes, now carefully preserved in protective wrapping. All 3 cards were posted from the Parish Hall box at the 515 collection, precisely along Nurse Eads' district route. Miss Debenham observed her posting letters at that location on the relevant dates. The cards themselves were cut from a bulk supply of black-edged memorial cards kept in the nurse's locked cupboard. The die-cut edges proved they came from a guillotine stack rather than individual purchases. "But why involve me at all?" Mrs. Temple asked, her voice trembling. "Because you maintained the Sick Comfort Fund records and had legitimate reason to interact with both the nurse and Mrs. Hartwell. Because you were known to be retiring and unlikely to investigate too deeply. And because having a village oracle claiming foreknowledge served to deflect attention from the actual mechanism of murder." Mr. Rakes shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I don't understand how the murders themselves were committed. Dr. Haydock certified both Mr. Brackley and Miss Denham as natural deaths. They appeared natural because they exploited medical conditions and treatments," Dr. Haydock said grimly. "Miss Marple identified the methodology before I did, to my shame." Miss Marple inclined her head. "The weapon was insulin, used in 2 different ways. For Mr. Brackley, who was not diabetic, a large injection produced severe hypoglycemia, a dangerous drop in blood sugar that mimics heart failure in elderly patients. The nurse had given him what he believed was a vitamin injection during a routine call. Within hours he died at his fireside, and I suspect no one thought to question it. For Ruth Denham, the method was more subtle," she continued. "Ruth was diabetic and administered her own insulin daily. But someone drew off her insulin and replaced it with sterile water from a blue ring diluent vial. When Ruth injected what she believed was her dose, she received nothing. Without insulin, she developed ketoacidosis overnight and died just as the first frost arrived, exactly as predicted. The orange peel in Nurse Ide's waste bin showed puncture marks where she had practiced the technique," Dr. Haydock added. "And Ruth's insulin bottle bore tap marks from a second needle, withdrawing and replacing the contents. I should have noticed these details immediately." "The timing was crucial," Miss Marple went on. "The deaths had to occur at the predicted hours to reinforce the appearance of prophecy. This required someone who understood medical timelines, and could calculate when hypoglycemia or ketoacidosis would reach fatal levels. Inspector Slack took up the narrative. The anonymous telephone calls to Mr. Vale's establishment came from the Parish Hall kiosk at 7:50 on both evenings, again along the nurse's route. She was observed near that location at the relevant times. The call served to make Vale seem unusually prepared for deaths, adding to the atmosphere of supernatural foreknowledge. Ernest Vale spoke for the first time, his voice subdued. "I never imagined. I thought perhaps Mrs. Temple genuinely possessed some gift. I meant no harm by preparing in advance." "Of course you didn't," Miss Marple assured him. "You were used just as Mrs. Temple was used. The entire village was used to create an atmosphere where murder could hide behind superstition." "What about the motive?" Lady Bantry asked. "Why would Phyllis do such terrible things?" "Money," Inspector Slack said bluntly. "The Sick Comfort Fund accounts show systematic theft over 18 months. Small amounts at first, then growing bolder. Mrs. Hartwell had discovered irregularities and planned to review the books thoroughly before signing a new will that would have ended the fund's generous endowment and triggered a proper audit." Mr. Brackley witnessed Nurse Mead altering an entry in the district visiting book, Miss Marple added. He grumbled about it to Mrs. Temple, not understanding the significance. But the nurse feared he would mention it to others and prompt investigation. Ruth Denham complained to several people about feeling strange after her injections and threatened to consult Dr. Hayduck directly. Both became liabilities. The third card, predicting Mrs. Hartwell's death at 9, was particularly calculated, she continued. The church clock runs slow on cold evenings, something every longtime resident knows. Nurse Ide planned to administer a massive insulin dose, disguised as a sleep draft, with Mr. Rakes and the constable present as witnesses when Mrs. Hartwell collapsed at the appointed hour. The village would have marveled at the accuracy of the prediction rather than examining the evidence of murder. Mrs. Temple spoke quietly. "I found things in my home, a torn card corner, a syringe seal. She must have used my coal scuttle to burn evidence during her visits." "She marked your almanac as well," Miss Marple said gently, recording her own schedule of rounds and collections to help plan the murders. "When you looked at the crosses and found them on significant dates, you naturally assumed you had made them yourself, or that something supernatural was occurring. That was precisely the confusion she intended to create." "I trusted her," Mrs. Temple said, tears in her eyes. "We all trusted her, which is why she was so dangerous," Miss Marple replied. "Trust is a sacred thing, and she corrupted it thoroughly. She convinced herself that her years of service justified theft, and that murder was acceptable to protect her position and reputation." There was a long silence, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. "What will happen to her?" Griselda asked. "She'll face trial for murder," Inspector Slack said. "The evidence is overwhelming. The insulin in her bag, the pattern of deaths, the financial records, the testimony of Miss Debenham and others about her movements. Justice will take its course." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles moving with their characteristic rhythm. "I have been thinking," she said conversationally, "about a saying my grandmother used to repeat, 'Murder is easy, but murder will out.' Phyllis believed her medical knowledge and her position of trust made her clever enough to kill without detection. But murder always leaves traces, and those traces speak to anyone willing to observe carefully." She looked up at Mrs. Temple with compassion. "You are a stamp set crooked." "My dear, used as a tool but never truly part of the design. But small tilts tell big truths, if one looks hard enough." Lady Bantry exhaled deeply. "No more prophecies, Jane." "Only timetables, Dolly," Miss Marple replied, her fingers never pausing in their work. and those I prefer from the railway, not from a black-edged card. Outside, the December afternoon was fading into early twilight. The snow had melted from the Lich Gate, and St. Mary Mead was returning to its customary rhythms. The Sick Comfort Fund would be reorganized under new management. Mrs. Hartwell's will would be signed as planned, and Mrs. Temple, freed from the shadow of unwanted prophecy, would return to her quiet life of genuine kindness rather than manufactured clairvoyance. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple remained a moment longer, gazing out at the village she had protected once again from the darkness that could hide in the most unexpected places. "Comfort is not a license," she murmured to herself, "and our telling belongs to clocks, not to those who would murder by timetable." Then she gathered her knitting, bid farewell to the Clements, and walked home through the twilight, already thinking ahead to tomorrow's tasks and the blessed ordinariness of a village at peace.